Hey guys, tonight we're going deep into the sleepy, hay-scented corners of medieval Europe. Whereas seriously, pigeons were elite royal couriers. You're standing in a damp stone stable just before dawn. The straw crunches under your boots, and somewhere overhead there's a flurry of feathers and a low coo that sounds mildly judgy. You can smell the musk of animals, ink, and something suspiciously like roasted turnips. I love seeing where in the world you're tuning in from. Stable hand, half asleep, and wrapped in what could generously be called a cloak. Holds up a small scroll and squints at it like it might explode. The birds coo and strut like tiny royals themselves, beady-eyed and irritable. She's not just flying, she's participating in the Pigeon Post Network, a medieval miracle of homing instinct and royal logistics. Landmarks, ancient bird maps, really want to fly back to where they came from. So if you raise a pigeon in Castle A, take it to Castle B, and release it, it will fly back to Castle A with smug determination. That makes it the ultimate one-way message delivery system. Just Dante, expect a reply unless someone has another pigeon? There's an order here, even if you don't see it yet. They're sipping mead and chuckling about how last winter, a pigeon carrying a royal invitation to a French duke accidentally flew to Flanders instead. Monarchs and their advisors used pigeons for high-stakes messages, including diplomatic invites, alliance proposals, and yes, those weird ceremonial parties where everyone pretended to enjoy cold boar tongue. If a bird refused to fly, it was taken as a sign that the king's invite should be rescinded. There were skeptics to our men in cloaks who insisted that any message sent by bird could be tampered with by ska bandits or foreign sorcery. One overly suspicious baron tried to put tiny bells on all his pigeons. It didn't help. This made him easier targets for hawks. One invitation to a royal wedding in Aragon was allegedly cancelled because the pigeon kept pooping on the scroll. Superstition or savvy diplomacy, you decide. This one's bound for a castle 3 leagues away where a noblewoman is throwing a tournament/birthday bash. You can already imagine the message. Your presence is required. Bring your own goblet. The dinner had to be rescheduled. Several nobles fainted from the scheduling inconvenience, with tidings of a cradle and crown. Whether those messages were timely is ... debatable. The air is thick with the scent of damp hay and something herbal. Maybe mint. Maybe medieval foot powder. You exhale and lean against the rough stone wall. Gilda is long gone, a feathered in the sky. One bird reportedly arrived 6 days after the prince had already taken his first steps. Now we wait, he says, like he did in tea. Just entrust an entire diplomatic situation to a 2-pound bird who once got scared by her own reflection. One of the squires grabs Gilda gently, strokes her wings to calm her, and tucks the scroll into a thin leather ring on her foot. In one particularly unfortunate incident, a pigeon carrying a royal decree flew directly into a cathedral window and stunned itself mid-flight. It was found days later by a monk who used the scroll to wrap his lunch. You watch him whisper something to her, some birds respond to names. After a land then with a swift toss, she's in the air, wings slicing through the gray sky. It reads something in Old French or Latin, but the meaning is clear. Royal pigeon keeper trespassers will be pecked. Inside the shed, a ledger is kept, feather-quilled and smudged, tracking birds by number, name, and flight record. Some of these birds are treated better than peasants. Actually, most of these birds are treated better than peasants. The royal seal is waxed to perfection. Someone very important is about to be invited to a coronation, a wedding, or a particularly long and unfun banquet with dried figs as the main attraction. And that scroll, it's not going by horseback. It's going to be tied to the foot of a fluffy, slightly annoyed pigeon named Gilda. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And have us your location and what time it is right now in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You crouch near the pigeon loft, a rickety wooden tower stuck to the side of the stone keep, smelling of droppings, dry grain, and ambition. Gilda, by the way, Docentino she is part of a centuries-old communication system that rivals your worst email chain. It all starts with a weird little quirk of biology. Pigeons, for reasons still not entirely agreed upon. Magnetism. As you stroll past the outer wall of this dusty estate, You notice a sunken garden with a few stone benches and nobles wearing questionable fur hats. But here's the twist. Despite how basic this all sounds, Pigeon Post wasn't some rural gimmick hit with serious royal business. You pass a wooden sign swinging on an iron bracket. Historians still argue whether pigeons were ever used to confirm royal births, since births were often secret, or strategically announced, but several journals from 13th century England mention pigeons arriving at distant courts. But not all went smoothly. Are rumors half-fact, half-feathered dream of pigeons being intercepted, eaten, or misled by reflective surfaces. There's also that delightful fringe story. Some nobles believed pigeons could sense bad omens. Of course, not everyone trusted this avian method. Back in the stables, a second pigeon is being prepped for launch. The wind picks up, rustling the feathers of the birds still perched in their coop. The squire turns to you and shrugs. And somehow, it all works.
Most of the time.
You're still in the chill morning air, standing near the edge of that mossy stone wall, when the squire, looking far too proud for someone wearing hay in his hair, starts recounting the origins of this whole feathered messaging obsession. You think we started this? He scoffs gently. Pigeons have been fighting wars since before we had decent plumbing, and he's not wrong. You close your eyes for a moment, imagining the scene shifting around you. The wind changes. The medieval fog lifts and is replaced by heat. Dry golden sand stretches under your feet now, and you hear the distant clang of bronze weapons. The Romans loved efficiency almost as much as they loved togas. The rebels cut off traditional roads, but the birds, they flapped straight over the chaos and landed with crisp, feathery defiance. A horse-drawn message might take 2 days to reach the next town. A pigeon, maybe 2 hours, if it doesn't stop to flirt with a statue along the way. By the 11th century, European nobles were dabbling in pigeon communication, though as usual, they made it about status. Owning pigeons wasn't just practical, it was fashionable. A noble S-worth could be measured in how many birds he had flapping around in his personal dovecote. It's part sport, part spectacle. Birds are released and timed, bets are placed. You hear one woman whisper, "I heard Lord Aldrich's bird made it from York to London in 6 hours." Birds that didn't flap aggressively or defecate mid-landing were apparently prized. Others were sent to religious houses to be blessed, as if a holy coup would make them more obedient. The pigeon post was a blend of ancient practice and medieval flair, a system of accidental brilliance and dumb luck. And somehow, in a world with no phones, no postal system, and a strong likelihood of being robbed by bandits, it kind of worked. The other gasps like he's just proposed. Like Instagram followers, but poopier. Pigeons may be efficient, but they are also wildly temperamental. They can panic at thunder, chase after unrelated flocks, or just decide midair that they're over it. A whole council once had to be postponed because the bird carrying the invitation ended up circling a bakery for an hour.
Oh.
To be fair, if someone strapped a scroll to your ankle and you passed a cinnamon roll, you might do the same. They built roads, aqueducts, and, yes, pigeon posts. During certain military campaigns, Roman generals stationed pigeons in conquered cities to send updates back to Rome. He reads aloud, mostly to himself, but half hoping you'll be impressed. This one here, Flint, carried the Great Council's feast invitation to the Duke of Kent in 2 hours. Never missed a drop. You raise an eyebrow? The bird in question is pecking furiously at a moth. There they go, flapping in lazy spirals, each one carrying a scrap of crucial information. The Islamic caliphates, particularly the Abbasids, in the 8th and 9th centuries, had some of the most sophisticated pigeon networks ever seen. Their system stretched across cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus. With trained handlers and pigeon towers stationed like medieval Wi-Fi routers, messages zipped between mosques, palaces, and military outposts long before Europe even figured out how to hold a fork correctly. Carved records hint at flocks raised in temple aviaries, blessed by priests, and released with urgent messages. And while the idea of holy homing birds might sound like a Monty Python bit, many believed that pigeons were touched by the gods' small, flappy divine couriers. One flew straight into her face. The others, clearly not feeling the vibe, just hovered above the cheese tray for an hour.
Needless to say, no wedding fall.
We've taken the western flank. The river crossing is secure. Or the much less useful, send more olives. Some claim pigeons were more of a ritual gesture like, "Look how fast I can communicate with the heavens," than actual messengers. Others point to surviving clay tablets that mention avian messengers as early as the 6th century BCE in Babylon. Regardless, the idea was already in motion long before medieval castles popped up. You're no longer in England or France. You're in ancient Persia, or maybe Egypt. Or possibly both, depending on which historian you ask. You squint toward the horizon, where armies gather not to charge, but to release pigeons into the sky. It's around 1150 BCE when we get our earliest murmurings of pigeons being used in organized communication, especially in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt. Historians still argue whether these ancient birds were trained for true long-distance delivery or just symbolic releases. Fast forward a few hundred years, and your sandals turn to dusty Roman boots. One Roman governor, Lucius Scribonius Libo, whose name sounds like an unfortunate breakfast, cereal allegedly used pigeons to maintain control of a province during a rebellion. You can almost hear a Roman centurion barking orders to a junior officer. Make sure that pigeon knows Latin. Back in the present, the medieval present, you hear hooves clopping past and the creak of wooden carts, reminding you of just how slow land-based communication still is. The medieval royals, forever obsessed with pageantry and power displays, began borrowing pigeon practices from both ancient texts and Islamic states. You overhear a merchant muttering about those clever Eastern birds. And indeed, the knowledge trickled westward through the Crusades and trade. There's a fringe story from 12th century France, probably apocryphal, but far too good to skip, where a minor noble tried to impress a visiting duchess by releasing 50 pigeons at once, each bearing a love poem. You step past a line of carved stone arches where noble women lounge, fans in hand, watching a small pigeon training session. And let's not forget the drama. Some fringe theorists, because, of course, there are believed certain birds were bred specifically for invitational etiquette. Back at the coop, the squire has pulled out a small logbook. Still, you have to admit it's weirdly impressive. You re-standing near the dovecote again? Now you know the word, watching a handler with soot-smudged hands? Carefully roll a sliver of parchment into something barely thicker than a noodle. You have to keep it tight, he mutters, but not too tight. If it cramps the leg, they get dramatic. You glance at the pigeon, nearby beady-eyed, puff-chested, and absolutely full of attitude, and you believe it. That tiny scroll is going on a journey, but not in a velvet pouch or secret box. Nope. It's being slid into a message tube strapped to the pigeon's leg, or sometimes its back. The message. An invitation to a royal christening. The guest list includes 2 dukes, a cardinal, and 1 noblewoman, who notoriously brings her own pudding. Warnings, threats, battle orders, and the occasional passive-aggressive "we noticed you haven't sent taxes this quarter." These weren't delivered in calligraphy. In more than one recorded case, pigeons being, after all, not trained scholars, mistook scrolls for snacks. Others had messages reinforced with beeswax coatings or tucked into linen satchels that looked like absurd tiny saddlebags. You picture one now, soaring over misty hills with a miniature messenger bag bouncing on its back. Medieval fashion, even for pigeons, had its moments. Rival noble houses. Yes, medieval people had rivalries like it was high school would capture pigeons, read the messages, and sometimes send fakes in return. Milk, lemon juice, even powdered nettle stuff that only revealed text when heated or treated with vinegar. You imagine some poor pigeon keeper fumbling over a torch trying not to set the scroll and the pigeon on fire? Success rates? Debatable. Follow it with your eyes until it's gone, just a speck against the clouds. You wonder how many birds like this are flying over Europe right now. 50? 100? More, each one a feathery little postman, facing wind and weather and the occasional hungry owl. Forgery was a cottage industry. Some clever tricksters developed wax seals that mimicked royal crests, and scrolls would be edited mid-flight. The message is short for words. Delay the ride, Snow. You glance outside. The skies are turning gray. Pigeon's wings twitch like it knows it's going to get wet. You silently wish it luck. You picture pigeons circling above cities, landing on towers, swooping past stained glass windows with scrolls dangling like bracelets. And all across the countryside, nobles are reading tiny invitations written in the scratchiest ink imaginable. They loved things that looked fragile, but carried great weight, much like their hats. One intercepted message was changed from "bring 6 guards to the gate" to "bring 6 goats to the gate." Confusing, smelly, not helpful. Especially if they were written on animal skin parchment, which, to a hungry bird, was basically jerky. His handler swore the bird would never fly unless the scroll had poetry on it. You picture this tiny feathered romantic in a silk ribbon, flitting from tower to tower, leaving heartbreak in his wake. Probably nonsense, but you'd like to believe it's true. Want to try one? He asks. You decline? You've seen what happens when people roll them too tight. A pigeon once limped for a week. Some flew home and then refused to let the human read the scroll, fluttering off the minute a hand came close. One chronicler tells of a pigeon who returned from Normandy, landed on the castle wall, then dove straight into the moat, with the message still strapped on. You wonder if it was a commentary on the message's content. Historians still argue whether this was common or just one of those weird things monks wrote down because their lives were otherwise 90% chanting and soup. Often the messages were hastily scrawled in code, shorthand, or symbols, especially if the sender suspected interception. One note discovered in a ruined pigeon tower centuries later simply read, "It is done. Burn the green ledger." Suspicious. Extremely. Probably taxes. For once very briefly and unsuccessfully, under a wing, which ended in a flurry of scroll confetti. And instead of a dignified yes or no, you get silence. Was the pigeon eaten? Was it intercepted by enemies? Or did it, as in one famous tale, simply get tired and stop at an inn's roof for a week? You watch as the handler threads the parchment into a little reed tube, ties it with a thread soaked in beeswax, and fastens it with a delicate leather strap. But not all messages were so polite. This one's written in Latin, but the language isn't the weirdest part. It's the fact that it ends mid-sentence. Apparently scribes were sometimes interrupted by things like raids, fires, or more often than you'd guess, falling asleep. Medieval people were constantly exhausted, so messages often arrived half-written, or worse, smudged beyond legibility because someone sneezed ink across the scroll. Medieval allergy season was no joke. See, pigeons weren't just carrying invitations, they were also sneaking secrets. You lean over to peek at another message being prepared. And then there were the birds who ate the messages. Yes, truly. In any case, pigeon keepers developed backup plans. Some birds flew in pairs, each carrying identical messages. But here's where things get extra complicated. Not all birds came back. Some got lost, confused by fog or storms. Every lost message was a mini disaster, imagine. You're a baron throwing a feast, waiting for a reply from the Count of so-and-so. An interception was real. Hawks weren't the only predators out there. Because of this, some messengers used secret inks. You move toward the edge of the tower where another pigeon is being prepared. This one bound for a castle perched atop a cliff near the sea. It launches into the air, scroll tight against its leg. It's all so elaborate, so unnecessarily delicate, but that's what makes it perfect for medieval royalty. You pass a young page practicing scroll rolling. His hands are sticky from honey and ink, which seems about right. He looks up at you and grins. The bell tower chimes in the distance. More messages are about to go out. There's even a rumor that one pigeon was trained to deliver only love notes. Because in a world of endless mud, plague, and itchy wool underpants, wouldn't you want a bird that only delivered rhyme declarations of affection? You find yourself strolling through a quieter courtyard now, shaded by ivy-covered archways and the occasional flutter of wings above. Pigeons, it turns out, are not just random birds off the street. They're practically medieval celebrities. You half expect to see astrological signs scribbled in the margins. Each one has a name, a perch, a feeding schedule. And this is not a joke of personality profile. Yes, they were a thing. A handler nearby holds a small wooden ledger filled with tiny inked entries like Giselle, shy. Prefers west routes, hates thunder and bramble, bold, fast, mildly aggressive. If a bird could make it from Durham to Windsor in less than 4 hours, it might be chosen for high-priority invitations. Coronations, war councils, or those mysterious midnight feasts that definitely weren't cult meetings. Definitely. If the pigeon lands on the wrong perch, no treats. If it arrives fast and correctly, it gets saffron-dusted grains and a loving head scratch. Only the strongest, smartest pigeons are paired. There are heated arguments over lineage. You can't pair Celeste with Basil. They're third cousins, and she hates his face. Yes, medieval pigeon politics were intense. You watch one puff up with self-satisfaction after being praised. You've never related to anything more. This is where you meet the real stars of the pigeon world, the elite messengers. They're not just any birds. They're trained, bred, and pampered like feathery Ferraris. Their S1 story about a noble woman who smuggled her champion pigeon nest eggs in her sleeves to avoid losing them during a siege. Their scroll tubes hang unused, but their feathers are brushed and shiny. It was effective, though mildly insulting to the bird's dignity. "That's Matilda and old Rowan," the handler says softly. Matilda delivered the king's plague warning in 89. Rowan flew through a siege with a letter sewn into his tail. You blink. Sewn. Historians still argue whether that happened or if it was exaggerated by a bored scribe with a thing for bird-related suspense. You wonder what its message says? A royal invite? A declaration of war? Maybe just we're out of meat again. From bold daredevils to drama queens, each pigeon had a place in the system. And somehow, through all the mishaps, rescues, and scroll nibbling, they kept the medieval world running just a little smoother. You watch as a sleek blue-gray pigeon flaps down gracefully onto a handler's shoulder, cooing smugly. Some lords, in a bid to impress visiting dignitaries, released flocks of pigeons who had no idea where they were going. One scroll, intended to arrive at a cardinal's villa, ended up in a fishmonger's rafters. The cardinal never forgave the insult or the smell. You peek into a smaller stone room near the stables and spot what looks like a pigeon obstacle course. Some pigeons get nervous flying over forests or near loud crowds. One royal pigeon named Buttercup once turned back mid-mission after a lightning strike hit nearby. She refused to fly again unless soothed with honey and lute music. Imagine a wedding invitation sent by Bird One that seals a union between powerful families. Now imagine that bird never arriving, or worse, arriving late. In the world of politics, a delayed pigeon could mean insult, dishonor, or war. One duchess reportedly called off an engagement because her pigeon-born proposal arrived a day after another suitor. She married the punctual one, the letter notes grimly. Miniature arches, hoops, dangling bells. Young handler whistles and waves a stick gently in the air, guiding a pigeon through the motions. Spot enemy hawks, discourage poachers, and ensure no rival intercepts the bird mid-flight. The Pigeon Air Force had security. A particularly greedy merchant once made a fortune by capturing message birds and reselling them with fake training. The result? Dozens of confused nobles receiving scrolls meant for others. One wrote, "Why have I been summoned to defend the orchard at dawn?" Another replied, "Please stop sending me your cheese inventory." Chaos, but hilarious chaos. It's part conditioning, part bonding. Birds were released from distant locations and expected to return home as quickly as possible. Spectators gathered. Bets were made. Fancy cheese platters were involved. The fastest bird got a ribbon, sometimes a tiny garland, occasionally if the noble was feeling festive a song written in its honor. Medieval fame, baby. That's Marlowe, the handler says with a wink. It's a 3-time tournament winner. Got invited to the Archbishop's coronation. Pigeon tournaments. In several parts of Europe, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries, nobles hosted timed pigeon flights. But these weren't just silly contests. These tournaments tested real courier routes. The training process for a royal messenger pigeon, surprisingly intense. These birds are trained not just to fly home, but to associate specific towers or banners with food, rest, or rewards. Breeding is another whole drama. Some families kept prized bloodline secret, passing down training scrolls and feeding blends like magical tomes. Still, it's clear these birds weren't just pets. They were assets, and occasionally enemies. Because in a time before fingerprinting, before email trails, or even reliable town criers, a pigeon could change the course of an alliance. This is why some lords hired pigeon guards. It's not like knights on horseback more, like boys with slingshots and an eagle eye. Their job, and yes, poachers were a problem. Back near the tower, you see 2 older pigeons in what looks like retirement fluffed up, half dozing in a sunbeam. Apparently, yes, when scrolls were too obvious or the bird too bitey, Some handlers hid messages by trimming a few tail feathers and slipping paper between them, binding it carefully. Of course, there were pigeon imposters too. Birds who flunked training but looked the part. You step into a feeding room and it smells like a blend of barley, warm feathers, and lavender, oil used, apparently, to calm the more anxious birds. Laugh all you want, her success rate was 97%. She carried 12 royal invitations and 3 love poems. The lute player? Promoted. These birds weren't just useful, they were characters. You watch one last bird take off from the rooftop perch, the wind catching its wings as it arcs into the setting sun. You reseated now beneath the rafters of a stone chamber that smells faintly of wax and damp wool. Around you, scribes and couriers shuffle parchment, dipping quills into inkpots, squinting at sunlight filtering through a stained glass window. Maybe the king wants to invite a rival lord to a diplomatic feast. It contains a royal seal, a date, and about 8 words of choppy Latin that translates loosely to arrive early. Bring wine, leave drama. Maybe a queen is calling her ladies and waiting for a midsummer hunt. Maybe someone wants to warn a castle 3 counties away that someone else is marching toward them in shiny armor in a very bad mood. A romantic dinner invitation? A spy report? A recipe for boiled goose? Historians still argue whether decorative pigeon messages were practical or purely for status, and especially not rival couriers who might accidentally drop the wrong scroll into the fire. So they started coding messages before strapping them to their birds. Others were more bizarre.
Waited maybe panic.
Their cryptic tendencies born from years of copying texts and hiding their wine stash from abbots made them natural coders. And as you learn, deeply unreliable. Pigeons don't love flying with damp messages, and vinegar-based inks sometimes corroded the tubes. One message was reportedly so acidic, it burned through the pigeon's pouch mid-flight. The bird made it. The scroll did not. It landed in a vineyard. Occasionally, townsfolk received notes, usually from distant relatives. Wandering merchants or lords giving orders, don't marry Bert. That pigeon made the flight in under an hour. Love is a great motivator, even with talents. Historians still argue whether this represented a real event or was just medieval optimism. The message is addressed to a chapel on the far coast. No one says what it contains, but the pigeon is fastened gently, kissed on the head, and released through the archway. Either way, it's clear that pigeons weren't just messengers. They were part of the emotional landscape. One baker famously received a pigeon-delivered message every Friday from his brother 2 towns away. The message? They're links in a chain that kept a whole society connected. Fragile, fussy, feathery links, but links nonetheless. A reminder not to overbake the rye. It gets dry, the scroll said. Every single week. The wine that year had hints of oak and espionage. One monastery near York is rumored to have trained a pigeon squad and developed their own cipher. Sadly, their codebook was lost in a fire, possibly eaten by a goat. Depends on which monk you ask. It included a picture of a snail, 3 acorns, and a fish wearing a crown. The message? Meet at the river bend on Thursday. Don't ask. A young page is experimenting with a double scroll method to stack notes in one tube. More efficient, he mutters. Moments later, his test bird refuses to take off, flaps wildly, and crashes into a wall hanging. You all pretend not to notice. Some say the fancier the scroll, the more likely it was to impress the recipient. Others believe it just made them easier for falcons to spot and intercept. Style versus stealth, eternal struggle. If you think doctors today have bad penmanship, just wait till you've seen 14th century noblemen trying to write quickly on slippery parchment during a thunderstorm. One pigeon-delivered note from Burgundy has stumped scholars for centuries. It may say, ready troops at river, or it may say reedy soup at dinner. No one's sure. Someone probably made both, just in case. This is the scriptorium, the beating heart of communication in the medieval court. And it's here that pigeon messages are born. The process begins with an invitation, a command, or a secret. Whatever the message, it needs to be short. You look down at a parchment the size of a cracker. Pigeon notes were the medieval equivalent of text messages, brief, to the point, and often poorly spelled. Not every lord had access to a trained scribe, so some pigeon messages were dashed off by whoever had ink, a vague grasp of grammar, and the least shaky hands. There is a famous case of a nobleman accidentally writing "Let us duel at dawn" instead of "Let us deal at dawn." That one ended badly. For him. And then there's the handwriting. But it wasn't all about speed. These notes had style. Wax seals were often applied, tiny blobs pressed with crests, sigils, or even a thumbprint. The messages might be trimmed with thread folded into triangles, or tucked into elaborately carved wooden cases before being strapped to the bird's leg. One overly enthusiastic earl once gilded his pigeon tube in silver. The pigeon in question, not thrilled, reportedly refused to fly for 2 days. You trace your finger over a scroll so delicate it crackles. It's written in French, looped with swirls and flourishes. Which brings you to the fascinating world of pigeon-based encryption. You see, sometimes nobles didn't trust anyone, not their scribes, not their servants. Some methods were simple. Switch a few letters, use initials instead of names. Monks were often the best at this kind of thing. You watch a scribe now carefully heat a message with a candle, revealing faint writing beneath the visible text. Lemon juice ink. Classic. The chamber around you hums with quiet urgency. Messages are being weighed, measured, folded. And amid all this chaos, you start to notice a pattern. It's not just about what gets sent, but who receives it. Because pigeon messages weren't only for kings and nobles. Even more charming, there were reports of lovers sending poems by pigeon. Shortest ever recorded was simply "Still yours, still waiting." And occasionally, pigeons became symbols. There's a stained glass window in northern Italy showing a white pigeon carrying a banner that reads "Hope Returns." You walk slowly toward the window, watching as another handler tucks a scroll into a small silver case. It flaps upward into the blue, its silhouette shrinking as it carries something between lives, between castles, between hopes. But you realize, somewhere between the scroll ink and wax seals, between the jumbled messages and biscuit-stuffed pauses, these pigeons aren't just mailmen. Now you're somewhere quieter. Sun has dipped lower, shadows stretch across the courtyard, and even the pigeons seem to settle into a softer rhythm. But if you think these birds always had an easy glide through life, think again. And sometimes those instincts said, "No thanks, I'd rather nap on a barn than deliver your high-stakes royal invitation." You're about to uncover the messier side of medieval pigeon logistics when messages missed. Disasters happened, and blame was assigned faster than you could say coup. Just giving up. One pigeon, lovingly named Almond by his handler, took off on a diplomatic run to Avignon. One duke's carefully timed treaty arrived 3 days late, because his bird got turned around in a storm and took shelter in a grain mill. When it finally arrived, soaked and confused, the opposing party had already signed with someone else. "Should have gone with horseback," someone muttered. You pull one open. It's about at all. One flock delivered their first messages perfectly, then turned feral and joined a monastery garden. A second test saw half the geese flying off in the wrong direction. One getting stuck in a bell tower, and the last pooping directly onto the mayor. Here, pigeon interference became political strategy. Rival factions began capturing birds mid-flight. Hawks were trained. Archers were paid. Some nobles even dressed their towers with confusing banners to lure enemy pigeons off course. That experiment was never repeated. Geese. One noble family famously used identical-looking birds for 3 different types of messages. Red thread for war, blue for peace, green for bring cake. One day, the threads got tangled. An ally received the red thread bird and promptly raised his army, while the intended cake never showed up. Probably for the best. The wind is cool, and a few pigeons flap gently around the tower rim. But one pigeon flew to the wrong manor, and the other refused to land until nightfall. The result? One lord received the queen wishes to, and then waited 2 days for the second pigeon to deliver. Borrow your loot for the banquet. He assumed the worst in the meantime. burned 3 bridges and most of his tapestry collection. A handler nearby is repairing a tiny saddlebag, muttering about last week's disaster. You eavesdrop, and was later spotted living his best life in a vineyard in Gascony. Good in theory. But what happened when all of them arrived at once in the middle of a formal dinner? You guessed it. Feathers in the soup, scrolls in the pudding, and a pigeon in the ceremonial wine cup. The guests applauded, then asked what the message was. Even now, with Wi-Fi and satellites, we still get typos, spam, and texts from Mom that were meant for Michelle. At least Pigeons had the decency to look flustered when they messed up. Turned out to be a hunting invite. For 2 weeks earlier, it helped messages move faster than a horse over mud or a monk with a bad ankle. And it proved one universal truth. Even in an age of swordplay and chivalry, nothing got done unless someone, somewhere, checked their messages. Eating grapes, gaining weight, the invitation, never delivered, the alliance, never formed, the pigeon, still a legend, the original scroll read, troops on schedule, arriving Thursday, the forged scroll read, delay movement, arrive next month. The ambush that followed became infamous, and the Baron toasted 2 bird-brained enemies that night. Her career spanned 5 lords, 3 sieges, and at least 2 betrayals. You half expect to find a pigeon memoir titled Feathers and Lies. Let's start with the obvious. Pigeons are birds. Birds have instincts. There are records more than one. A pigeon simply not returning, not eaten by hawks, not intercepted by enemies. And then there's the weather. Rain, fog, heavy wind. These were all pigeon kryptonite. Sort of like medieval passwords. The wolf runs east might confirm that the message hadn't been altered. But that, of course, led to entire counter-strategies of faked passwords and double-agent pigeons. Yes, that's a thing now. Double-agent pigeons. Some scholars believe the royal courts kept secret pigeon failures under wraps, so they wouldn't appear weak. Others think the bird system was openly mocked, but no one could agree on a better solution. But even under clear skies, problems brewed. Like bird mix-ups. Imagine you're Lord Harwick, anxiously awaiting your cousin's reply to a marriage proposal. A pigeon arrives. You unfurl the scroll only to read, 10 barrels of salted cod will suffice. You assume it's an insult. You declare war. Later you find out the pigeon was just tired and accidentally landed at the wrong estate. Oops, historians still argue. Whether medieval nobles really understood how fragile pigeon-based comms could be, or if they just pretended it was all perfectly reliable to save face. And speaking of better solutions, some people tried. Enter the improvisers. You pause at a musty corner of the archive where several scrolls are labeled in smudged ink. Experiments? Yes. Someone tried to use geese as messengers. Bigger birds, more visible, theoretically able to carry heavier messages. The problem? It refused to return home. But not all pigeon mishaps were so innocent. There were saboteurs. You lower your voice a bit as you step into the war room, a gloomy stone alcove, where strategies and correspondences were drafted. A particularly devious baron once swapped the message from a captured bird and sent it along, unchanged in appearance, but deadly in meaning. Naturally, to counter this, couriers and pigeon handlers began adding tiny code phrases only their allies would recognize. In one bizarre tale, a trained bird named Eloise was stolen, then recaptured, then used to feed misinformation back to the very people who took her. And sometimes pigeons caused confusion, even when they did everything right. Then, there were the message clusters, when multiple birds were sent, with similar instructions to ensure delivery. You reach the top of a spiral stairwell and step out into open air again. Apparently someone tried to send a 2-part message, half of it in each of 2 pigeons. Odd. But amid the madness, there's a strange comfort to all this, you realize. Communication has always been messy. And despite everything, the weather, the sabotage, the sheer pigeon stubbornness, the system worked more often than it failed. It kept kingdoms talking. You lean against the stone ledge, watching a new bird take off into the sky. You hope its scroll makes it. You hope it doesn't stop for grapes. You're tucked beneath an old balcony now, cloaked in creeping ivy, and the sound of distant flapping wings. The air smells faintly of hay, parchment, and the sour temps of old brass. 'Cause tonight, you're going behind the curtain, or rather, into the loft. to meet the unsung geniuses of this feathery network, the pigeon handlers. The folks who trained, groomed, and sometimes emotionally blackmailed birds into flying cross-country with tiny medieval to-do lists. You spot one now, crouched over a shallow clay dish of crushed millet, muttering sweet nothings to a puff-chested pigeon named Truffle. Her eyes glint red in the twilight, and she's wearing the pigeon equivalent of a bored teenager's expression. Gazelle Sir Pufferton. Egbert the slightly damp. The names were more for the handlers than the birds, of course. Pigeons can't read. These birds carried war declarations, secret treaties, and on one infamous occasion, a saucy limerick that caused a 3-year family feud. If you messed up heavin'. Once it wasn't just bird poop on your tunic you had to worry about. One mishandled scroll could get you demoted to muckboy, or worse, transferred to goose duty. But it helped form a bond, and pigeon handlers were nothing if not emotionally invested. You had to make home so irresistible that the bird would ignore all other urges fear. Hunger adventure end, just bolt back to its coop like a tiny feathery boomerang. Some even claimed to have special relationships, knowing when a pigeon was ready to fly just by looking into its beady eyes. No tracking, no checking. You train, you release, you trust. That's the job. There are recorded cases of handlers dressing their pigeons in tiny cloth hoods for protection, or dabbing their feet with herbal oils to soothe the landing. One infamous handler in southern England developed miniature leather boots for his fleet. Stylish and practical, he claimed. Ridiculous and unnecessary, his wife countered. Others swore by pre-flight rituals blessing the scroll, whispering instructions, or offering a crumb tribute to the loft guardian, a stuffed owl nailed to the eaves. A place where loyalty wasn't just a word, it was something with wings, ready to fly into the unknown and, hopefully, come back again. Was it superstition? Probably. Did it work? Also probably. Who are we to argue with results? One pigeon named Clotilde reportedly flew home with a torn wing and one leg dangling. There's something oddly peaceful about this place. The way everything revolves around patient routine, the quiet flutter of wings, the deep, unwavering trust between bird and human. But still clutching a scroll that read, "Enemy delayed. Hold bridge." She got extra millet that night, and possibly a tiny medal. Reports vary. The pigeon flaps twice, then shoots off like a little gray comet. The handler doesn't even watch it go. He just turns back to the coop and starts prepping the next. But in reality, pigeon training was done in lofts, towers, barns, wherever you could keep the birds safe and the distractions few. One handler was quoted as saying, "I'd rather tie a scroll to a potato and toss it across the moat." The technique was deceptively simple. Take a baby pigeon, let it bond to a single location, then start taking it farther and farther away, releasing it each time. If it came back, you fed it. If it didn't, you notice how calm both seem. The bird isn't flapping, it's just ... waiting. This apparently is trained behavior. The good birds don't panic, they just wait for the signal. Well, you said you fed it when it returned. Motivation matters. To do that, handlers used everything from sugar-dipped seed to well-timed cuddles. Some even sang to their birds off-key lullabies in regional dialects. One 13th century text from Flanders insists that pigeons respond better to soprano voices. Another argues that baritones make them weep softly. Historians still argue whether this was real avian psychology or just lonely pigeon keepers needing to vent. Yes, cuddles. But don't question the methods. This isn't some fancy falconer in gold robes and dramatic gloves. This is a pigeon wrangler. A blend of farmer, spy, therapist, and occasional seamstress. Training pigeons was less about dominance and more about psychological warfare. Now, you probably imagine grand medieval bird schools, complete with little chalkboards and stern owl professors. Most handlers swore by routine, feed at the same time, open windows the same way, whistle the same tune every morning. You walk past rows of hand-carved pigeon boxes, little wooden apartments, complete with straw bedding, air holes, and sometimes even names scratched above the entrance. Now, not just anyone could become a handler. You had to be trusted, which, by the way, was a thing. Remember those geese from earlier? Still aggressive, still loud, still very not into message delivery. But pigeon handlers, true pigeon handlers, loved their work. They believed in their birds. Now comes the moment of launch. A handler approaches with a pigeon cradled in one hand, scroll already secured in its leg tube. And there it is, a short whistle, 2 taps on the wooden ledge, and a gentle toss into the air. That's the other thing about pigeon handlers. Their emotional attachment ended at takeoff. Of course, some took it further. Still, pigeons kept coming back. Even after storms, after injuries, after being shot at by jumpy castle guards, you rest your hand on a rough wooden perch, the scent of feathers, an old straw in your nose. And maybe in a world of clanging swords and fragile alliances, this little corner of calm meant something. You duck beneath a wooden rafter, brushing aside a fluttering parchment, and step into a chamber lit only by the pale glow of a stained glass window. Dust swirls like lazy ghosts, and in the middle of the room, a table bowed from the weight of ancient scrolls lies. Tonight, treasure trove. The pigeon messages themselves. These weren't sprawling letters, more like medieval tweets. Concise, urgent, weirdly poetic, and they had to be. It was attached to the pigeon's leg or back using a small strap, or in fancier courts, a pigeon harness. Most were dictated to scribes trained in the art of typewriting, which is as ridiculous and real as it sounds. These scribes used special quills trimmed to a needlepoint, and ink made with finer soot particles to prevent smudging on the tiny strips of parchment. One scribe boasted he could fit an entire battle plan onto a piece of vellum smaller than his thumb. Historians still debate whether this was true skill or just very optimistic self-promotion. These were the tiny haute couture of the bird world. In times of war, petty noble gossip, pigeon messages often use cipher systems or references known only to the sender and receiver. The challenge is keeping those keys secure. If your cipher book fell into the wrong hands, even a pigeon couldn't save you. Which is why some messages were double-wrapped, with the inner scroll bearing the real text and the outer scroll acting as a decoy. You read one such decoy aloud, the red goose might refer to an incoming army, or a noble woman with fiery hair and terrible table manners. Hard to say. Think leather cuffs, brass clasps, and the occasional gem-studded ring for high-born birds. Because if your rival had a pigeon in basic hemp cord, but your bird flew in wearing gold and garnet, you'd already won. After all, you could only ask a pigeon to carry so much weight. Nobody was sending long-form love letters by bird. You needed the kind of writing that could fit into a nutshell, literally. You pick one up. It's tiny, barely bigger than a thumb, rolled tight and sealed with wax. The typical message tube was made of parchment or hollow bone, sometimes copper, sometimes hardened wax. The messages inside were rarely written by the noble themselves. You unroll a sample scroll. It reads, to Lady Grevlin, storm delays arrival, delay feast, send more pears. It wasn't logistics, it wasn't war, it was just feelings. Now imagine that scroll flying 100 miles tied to a feathered missile. Simple, effective, kind of cute. Not all messages were so clear, though. Some were intentionally cryptic. You find one that reads, the red goose lands before moons, second blink. No, that's not a medieval haiku. Code. The pigeon eventually returned with the scroll, too late to prevent heartbreak and the partial destruction of a hedge maze. Unfortunately, pigeons don't tell time. If they got delayed due to weather, hawks, or an impromptu nap, the timestamp meant nothing, so yes. One treaty did almost collapse because a pigeon showed up a day late with a scroll marked Urgentide nor, if past Wednesday. It was Thursday. Oops. To decode, recipients relied on keyword books or prearranged phrases. Trained pages or stewards were responsible for checking the lofts daily, removing new scrolls, logging them into wooden cabinets, and sorting them by urgency. And because humans love labels, someone eventually invented a color-coded ribbon system. The dog sleeps near the turnip bin. Praise be to St. Anselm. Still, it reminds you that even in the Middle Ages, people were messy, emotional creatures trying to connect only with birds instead of smartphones. Completely meaningless, until you unwrap the inner scroll, which says, one duchess, in a fit of romantic rage, sent a pigeon to her suitor that simply read, invasion from northern pass expected by dusk. It burned supply crates. Every scroll told a story, not just what was written, but who wrote it, how it flew when it landed, and what it disrupted. These tiny time capsules weren't just communication tools. They were social lifelines, tactical weapons, passive-aggressive complaints, and declarations of love and lunch preferences. And there it is, the thumping heartbeat of pigeon-powered espionage. But let's not pretend all messages were life or death. Some were hilariously mundane. One Duke received a blank scroll with a smudge of mustard and a single doodle of a frog. To this day, historians still debate whether it was an inside joke or a culinary protest. Pigeon mail wasn't perfect, but it was human. Sent by hand, carried by wing, received with hope. One castle used pigeons to relay messages like, "Ale barrel empty. Request refill." Another sent this gem to a neighbor. "Your sheep ate our roses again. Send apology or stew." One pigeon, bless its feathery soul, carried the following note during a week-long festival. "Joust delayed. Night broke a tooth. Send mint paste." Now there's one message type that still baffles scholars. The emotional update. You find one such message, aged and smudged with what might be wine. "I miss your laugh by the fountain." Even the fish seems sad. Sentimental, but also logistically questionable. What's the pigeon supposed to do with that? Of course, sometimes those emotional messages led to problems. It's over. Don't ask why. The suitor who never received it because the pigeon got lost showed up 2 weeks later with a lute and a love poem. Chaos ensued. Guards were summoned. This is why some nobles preferred to include timestamps, little markings like for delivery before dusk or burn after reading. As pigeon mail grew more complex, so did the scroll storage systems at receiving castles. Red ribbon. Military or security. Blue ribbon. Political or diplomatic. Yellow ribbon. Personal. Family. Green ribbon. Food related. No ribbon. Mystery or prank. A scroll with no ribbon was either deeply suspicious or deeply hilarious. And you know what? Maybe that's the charm. So as you roll the last scroll back into its tiny brass tube, you start to understand something. Sometimes, just sometimes, responded to with cake. You lean against the cool stone of a watchtower window now, peering down at a distant green valley below. A sliver of sky flickers silver in the rising sun, and you spot it. A small, fast-moving shape hurtling across the horizon. That's not a hawk, it's a pigeon on a mission. And tonight, you're about to witness what happens after the scroll's journey is complete. The pigeon has landed, but its problems have just begun. Because while pigeons were marvels of endurance and direction, they weren't always welcomed gently on arrival. In fact, you're now standing in the most unpredictable part of the process, the receiving end. Most castles had dozens of pigeons fluttering in and out, some belonging to allies, others to rivals, and a few just freeloading local birds looking for snacks. A boy named Arnaud is dozing in the corner, bell still clutched in hand. He nods once, tucks the scroll into a velvet pouch, and hurries down the spiral stairs to the great hall, where a banquet is in full swing and Duke Thorn is mid-boar bite. A pigeon lands with a smug coo, and Arnaud snaps awake, yelps, and rings the bell like it's on fire. Dodd. So how did you tell who was who? The place where one careless moment could turn a noble as urgent message into a pile of soggy bird confetti. One dog named Marzipan became famous for delivering scrolls tucked behind her ear. She received a wreath of rosemary for her service. And a sausage. Probably more exciting. Can't see the message, but you can hear him yell and tie it back onto the poor bird's leg. By the time it landed, the original question had been answered, debated, rebutted, and insulted. The final message simply read, "You're impossible. I'm planting onions." This worked great until the scrolls became so layered that pigeons began waddling under the weight. Scrolls were logged, messages delivered, and birds rested, fed, and sent back, sometimes with rewards like seed cakes or affectionate scritches behind the head. A few lucky birds even got a bath, followed by time in a warm rest box, lined with wool and lavender. Luxurious. In times of war or political intrigue, arriving scrolls were read in candlelit rooms, their words whispered into trusted ears. Not the secret ones, those were usually burned, but the less urgent correspondence that still held value. Scrolls detailing feasts, rainfall, wheat shortages, marriage proposals, sheep complaints. A page collects the message. Another scroll successfully delivered, received, and cataloged. It arrived frozen, furious, in carrying a scroll that had absorbed enough moisture to be unreadable. in the hope that a tiny bird could cross a dangerous sky and still find its way back to your windowsill. The receiving steward attempted to dry it by firelight, promptly set it ablaze. A living library of winged messages. Sometimes, just to be sure, nobles demanded a second pigeon carry the same message, a feathered backup, if you will. Tell Lady Seraphine, I will not wear orange, even for peace. It led to logistical nightmares, overcrowded coops, and one bird rebellion. First, there was the issue of recognition. Yes, painted. Yes. Scribes and handlers would dab bird wings with natural dyes indigo. Ochre, crushed beetle creating patterns that indicated their origin. If no handler was around, or if a sleepy page missed the flutter of wings, the scroll might go unnoticed for hours or worse, be pecked at by curious pigeons. One particularly scandalous incident involved a duke's hunting schedule being eaten by a bird named Lemon Cake. He was not forgiven. A zigzag might mean from the northern marches, while a dotted tail meant don't open Lady Brigitte's eyes only. Historians still argue whether these markings ever confused pigeons during mating season. You guessed it, pigeon fashion. Birds were often marked with colored leg rings, tiny embroidered tags, or even painted feathers. The real trouble started once the bird reached the loft. So castles established birdwatching shifts, sung boys or apprentices assigned to sit near the pigeon coop with a bell, a biscuit, and very little dignity. If a bird arrived, they rang the bell. If they missed it, they were dunked in the moat. Brutal but effective. You make your way to one of these receiving stations now. A sunlit alcove high in a turret, with straw-covered ledges and scroll racks labeled by category. Urgent, personal, odd smell.
Nice.
Within moments, a steward bustles in, retrieves the scroll with tongs, and examines the outer markings. The scroll is handed over with exaggerated care. Duke squints, breaks the wax, reads the contents, and lets out a snort laugh that sends crumbs flying. Messages weren't always treated so lightly, of course. One particularly paranoid king insisted every message be delivered in triplicate by 3 different birds. Now, sometimes the receiver wasn't even human. In smaller strongholds, trained dogs were used to fetch the pigeon and bring it gently to their masters. You wander to the castle's archive room now, where older scrolls are stored. And here comes the fun part. Sometimes people wrote replies on the original scrolls. Yes. Instead of sending fresh parchment, they'd just write in the margins or on the back, folded up again. One pigeon from Toulouse reportedly returned home with 5 stacked scrolls, each a reply to the last. Despite all the risks, the receiving end of pigeon mail was a marvel of medieval efficiency. Of course, there were disasters too. One winter storm blew a pigeon off course for 3 days. Another pigeon arrived mid-joust and spooked a war horse so badly that the knight was flung directly into the pickle cart. The message it carried? Rescheduled tournament. Weather turning. You sigh, amused, watching a new pigeon land on the ledge, legs twitching, feathers ruffled. It was easy to forget that this system was built not on technology or brute force, but on trust routine. And maybe, just maybe, land without starting a food fight. Now, you find yourself on the castle's parapet, the wind pushing your cloak gently around your ankles. And you're staring up at the sky, where a small, silvery cloud drifts slowly past. This is the airspace where dreams were made. Because let's be honest, for every triumphant scroll delivery, there was a crash landing, a missed message, or a very confused bird circling the wrong tower. Some pigeons were heroes, but many were, let's just say, endearingly incompetent, and often crushed by a hungry hawk. Because while pigeons might have been the darlings of medieval communication, they weren't the only things flying up there. Hawks, falcons, even especially aggressive crows, saw messenger pigeons as airborne lunch deliveries. That's why some noble families kept trained falconers not to send messages but to escort them. These falconers would walk the countryside with flags, bells, or trained decoy birds, attempting to distract predators and clear the airspace like medieval air traffic control. Tonight you're diving headfirst into the drama of pigeon-based failure. First, the weather. Pigeons may be impressive, but they're still birds, and birds don't exactly thrive in hailstorms. Heavy rain could soak their feathers, making them heavy and less aerodynamic. Snow, a complete feathered disaster. And in high winds, a pigeon might fly miles off course and land in entirely the wrong kingdom. One intercepted scroll meant to announce a royal wedding was replaced with a note reading, "If a pigeon wasn't properly trained on its route or was distracted by, say, a particularly handsome fellow pigeon sunbathing on a thatched roof, Fit might veer wildly off course." One poor bird, trained in Normandy, was sent with a scroll to a noblewoman in Calais. Instead, it was found 5 days later in a tavern chimney in Bruges. The scroll read, "Arriving at sundown. Please warm bath and cider." But not everyone knew the correct color codes or had the proper keys to verify authenticity. So fake messages still slipped through. One court historian swore that a war nearly broke out between two dukes because of a false message reading. Ironically, the bird received both.
Oh.
From a bartender named Jacques. He was beautiful, sleek feathers, keen eyes, perfect build, but utterly useless. No matter the message, he would fly directly to the local bakery and sit on the chimney until someone brought him crumbs. The castle's steward sent a pigeon to another outpost with the message. Of course, weather wasn't the only problem. Let's talk predators. It didn't always work. She claims they arrived by God's will. I claim theft. These were the rebels, the freeloaders, the little feathered divas who, mid-training or mid-flight, would decide they were done, which meant you had to plan carefully sending a pigeon from Castle A to Castle B. Meant that same pigeon could not be reused unless physically transported back to a logistical nightmare. This also led to accidental pigeon theft. When someone forgot where the bird came from, or more likely liked the bird so much, they just kept it. One famously unfortunate scroll reached its destination after 10 days of storm delay, only to be pecked to pieces by the castle cat 5 minutes after arrival. You'd tie the scroll, give them a gentle toss into the wind, and instead of soaring valiantly across the kingdom, they'd flap exactly 12 feet, land on a windowsill, and take a nap.
What?
Some inventors experimented with tiny pigeon shields, leather or metal plates attached to their backs to deter claws or arrows. It was adorable. It was ridiculous. It didn't work. People expected pigeons to mess up sometimes. That's what made the successful deliveries feel almost magical. As if the universe and this tiny bird had decided just this once to be merciful. One account describes a falcon intercepting a pigeon mid-flight, causing both to crash onto the roof of a monastery, where the monks mistook them for a divine omen. They were wrong. It was just Tuesday, and sometimes the pigeons just got lost. Even the best birds had off days. Strangely heroic. It launches upward, scroll tucked under its wing, and for a moment you hold your breath. One medieval noble's diary reads, in slanted ink, "Pigeon returned from battlefront. No scroll. Muddy beak. Possibly drunk." Historians still argue whether that's a metaphor or whether someone really was slipping fermented grain into the coop. And then, of course, there were the pranksters. Pigeons made great targets for bored teenagers, rivaled nobles, or angry exes. Some scoundrels intercepted birds mid-flight, replacing the message with something absurd. "The king has turned into a trout. Long live the fish." Cue panic, followed by 3 days of fish-related parables and court sermons, before someone figured it out. To protect against tampering, some messengers began using sealing wax, ribbons, or complex knots on the message tube. "Your beard smells like wet bread." Didn't help that both men had beards and bread was a touchy subject. But let's not forget the birds who simply refused to play. One bird named Trombone was infamous for this. Trombone is no longer with us. He lives at the bakery now. A noble's life is tough. Pigeons know this. Oh, to make things worse, pigeons couldn't handle multiple destinations. They were trained to fly to one place only. One night, writing to his sister, said, "I suspect Lady Alwyn has stolen 3 of my fastest birds. Lady Alwyn never returned the birds. She did, however, send back 1 pigeon with a message that read, 'They prefer me. I feed them real peas.'" And who could argue with that? Even when birds did return successfully, scrolls were vulnerable. Moisture, mold, rat damage, walled, potential threats. Which brings you to one of the stranger defenses. Bird armor. Yes, you heard that right. One pigeon wearing chainmail was so weighed down it flew directly into a tree and was retired immediately. But hey, at least it went out with style. Despite all this chaos, the failures somehow added to the legend. You're back in the courtyard now? Handler is coaxing a pigeon into flight. Will it make it? Will it crash? Will it end up in a soup kitchen somewhere, serenaded by monks? That's the gamble. Got Pigeon post. Unreliable. Hilarious. And often just one step away from complete disaster. You're walking through a narrow, cobbled lane now, the kind that smells like damp straw and faintly of turnips, lined with wooden stalls and the occasional very confused chicken. No more castles for the moment. Tonight, you're heading into the bustling world of pigeon trainers, the unsung. Sleep-deprived, occasionally singed heroes of the feathered messaging world. Welcome to the coop behind the curtain. You duck under a sagging clothesline and arrive at a low-roofed shed buzzing with the quiet cooing of about 50 pigeons. The trainer here, a wiry man named Osmond with hay in his beard and a permanent squint, nods at you and jerks a thumb toward the loft. Mind your step, he mutters. They're molting. Makes him cranky. See those tiny numbered slates nailed above each nesting box? That's how he tracks the birds' training cycles. Some fly better at dusk. Others prefer early morning. That meant raising the baby pigeon in the loft where you wanted it to return. You couldn't move them around afterward. They weren't Airbnb birds. Their homing was specific to one place. It's made the logistics of medieval pigeon posts something like a game of hot potato mixed with a jigsaw puzzle. And a few his champions fly well, no matter the time, the wind, or the random cheese festival happening below. Cranky is an understatement. You raise pigeons at the abbey, keep them at the castle, and release them when you want to send a message back. Pigeons weren't boomerangs. This created what one modern historian described as an elaborate and deeply inconvenient network of pigeon custody agreements. The bird, recognizing its true home as the abbey loft, flies straight there. One misstep, and someone's wedding got scheduled on the wrong day. Or the wrong cousin. Yikes. Because while pigeons may look dainty mid-flight, raising them is anything but glamorous. Feather trimming, wing massage, light conditioning with bells or scents. Some even whispered to their birds like they were reciting bedtime poetry. Inside are 3 birds with ruffled feathers and definite attitudes. One is missing a toe. Another has a scar near her eye. The third is asleep in a nest made of ribbon scraps and bread crusts. Flew through hail the size of acorns. Got caught in a chimney. Landed anyway. Did it work well? Some birds flew straighter afterward. Some pooped on the trainer's head. Science remains divided. Trainers like Osmond start their work before dawn, cleaning droppings, checking feathers, and preparing specialized diets. No, really, these birds ate better than most peasants. Tiny books filled with squiggly notes. How long a bird took to return, how many times it got lost, what it liked to eat, whether it reacted poorly to loud music. Some pages include sketches. Others have little doodles of poop piles. Osmond shows you one labeled Gustav's tragic wrong turn. It's too much handling and they'd get clingy. One particularly attached bird named Clover once followed her trainer to the bakery, the bathhouse, and finally the bishop's garden, where she accidentally kicked off a rumor of divine signs. They'd brag in taverns about flight times, scroll weights, even bird temperament. There's a story about 2 pigeon trainers who had such a heated dispute, they sent their fastest birds at each other. The pigeons collided midair, dropped like rocks, and landed in a beekeeper's yard. Neither man won. The bees did. Historians still argue whether this led to a 5-day fast or just a very confused bishop. The sun is sinking again, casting golden light across the rooftops. Behind you, pigeons rustle and coo, their soft noises oddly comforting. Grains, berries, crushed eggshells, the occasional lard-laced oat cake. He may not be famous. He may not even be clean. But without him, and people like him, royal invitations would never arrive. Alliances would never be confirmed, and kings might accidentally marry the wrong cousin. A few got confused and nested mid-mission. One pigeon reportedly joined a troupe of traveling actors for 2 weeks before remembering he had a job. All in the name of sky speed. Messages flown under cover of darkness were usually urgent troll summons, battlefield updates, or really bad gossip. It's the kind of stuff that couldn't wait for sunrise. Each pigeon needed careful socialization. It's too much isolation, and they'd forget their training. But Osmond's not just feeding birds and hoping for the best. He's a tactician. These prime flyers often had names that sounded more like knights than birds. Emberstorm, Lady Gertrude, Ironquill. There's even one named the Butter Ghost, don't ask. Osmond won't explain it, and you've asked twice already. Training a pigeon began when it was just a squeaky fledgling, barely old enough to peep. Step 1. Imprint location. So how do you get a message from Castle Whittleton to Abbey Upton? Simple. No, you can't reverse it. Which is why pigeon trainers became such prized staff. They were trusted to manage not just the birds, but the entire flow of information. Trainers developed tricks to make birds faster and more reliable. Then there were the special operations. Osmond leans in and whispers this next part. Sometimes he says we trained pigeons for night flights. You blink night pigeons? Oh yes, he nods, rare, risky but real. To do it, they'd condition the birds over weeks with low-light flights, feeding at dusk and lantern guidance. Of course, night-flying pigeons weren't exactly stealth bombers. Back in Osmond's loft, you spot an old wooden box labeled retired. These, Osmond says, are my war heroes. He strokes the sleepy one on the head. That's Mildred, carried word of an ambush during the North Border squabbles. You nod solemnly. Mildred opens one eye and burps. And then there's the paperwork. Oh yes, trainers kept records. Trainers were known to form rivalries too. You step out of the loft now, blinking in the fresh air. You think about Osmond, this hay-covered bird whisperer, this planner of feathery flight paths. So next time you see a pigeon bobbing along the street, maybe give it a respectful nod. It just might be on its day off. You're walking now through the cold stone corridor of a monastery, not a palace this time, not a fortress, but a place of quiet murmurs and gentle candlelight. And yes, there are pigeons here too, because monks, those endlessly scribbling, brewing, copying multitaskers of the medieval world, had a surprising connection to the great bird-based postal network. You step into a cloister courtyard, and immediately you hear the coos. Not from a wild flock, these are trained. Nestled beneath the arches are wooden lofts, tidy and blessed with little carved crosses on their sides. Welcome to the avian division of monastic life. You probably didn't expect monks to double as pigeon wranglers, but they did. Many abbeys, especially in remote areas, raised pigeons both for messages and for, well, dinner. Sorry, it's true. Not every pigeon was destined for royal dispatches. Some were destined for soup. Long-distance flights required the loft to be set up in Rome before a message could be sent there, which meant someone had to raise a flock in Italy, carry them to France or England, and then wait for the message to come back. A process that historians agree was both brilliant and stupidly complicated. But the special ones, the dark-eyed, sharp-winged messengers were part of a broader system of ecclesiastical communication. Birds filled the gap. One well-documented pigeon route connected Lindisfarne Abbey with the mainland, flying scrolls across the icy North Sea winds. The monks even built windbreak towers to protect their launch sites. Yes, actual prayers. Before releasing a bird, Eustace would murmur a Latin benediction, mostly for the bird's safety, but also he admits for a dramatic flair. One particularly aggressive friar in Devon kept poaching pigeons from a neighboring abbey by baiting their lofts with fancy feed. No one really listened, but the messages got more polite. It escalated until a monk war broke out not with swords, but with increasingly sarcastic scrolls delivered by the very pigeons in question. He pulls a scroll from his robes and chuckles, showing you a tiny scrap of parchment. A particularly scruffy bird once crash-landed on the altar during morning mass and was promptly renamed Holy Geoffrey. He was given his own perch and lived to a ripe old age, occasionally stealing communion wafers and sleeping in confession booths. He named them after virtues: charity, humility, obedience, and so on. Obedience, ironically, was the most unruly and once vanished for 3 weeks before showing up in Wales with a note that said "Nice Abbey." Keeping him. No return address. Rude. Churches and abbeys had a surprising amount to say to each other. And with the state of medieval roads, sometimes it was faster and safer to send your update by bird, especially if that update involved money, schedules for pilgrimage routes, or particularly scandalous confessions. In a world that often feels frantic, they created a still point, a place where birds could rest, scrolls could travel, and miracles could arrive with a flap of wings. Monks preserved much of what we know today about pigeon messaging. A pigeon flutters down beside you, tilts its head, and stares like it's judging your life choices. Fair enough. Their records, diaries, and scrolls are among the most complete surviving accounts of medieval bird communication. Without their methodical note-taking, we might not know about the butter ghost or obedience's vacation. or the pigeon-pilfering friar of Devon. Historians still argue whether that referred to a tax collector or a particularly persistent monk with a sweet tooth. One scroll, reportedly sent from an abbey in Yorkshire to a priory in Lincolnshire, contained only the Latin phrase, "He's back." Hide the honey. They kept detailed records, labeled every loft, and tracked bird behavior like tiny feathery saints in training. Some scrolls were written in ciphers or used keyword substitution, especially if they involved sensitive matters like heresy reports, hidden relics, or land ownership documents. Of course, the encryption was only as good as the receiving monk's ability to crack it. One famous mix-up involved a simple cipher that was misread, leading an abbey to believe they were under Viking threat. Plus, they weren't allowed to shout across the countryside or storm into courtrooms waving scrolls. Quiet pigeon fit their whole vibe. Pigeons made perfect sense for monastic messaging. Monks were already trained in patience, precision, and caretaking. One Benedictine monk, Brother Alaric, was famously obsessed with his pigeons. Church leaders occasionally used pigeons to communicate with bishops or even the Pope, though very carefully. You walk beside a monk now, Brother Eustace, who explains how they train their pigeons with bells and prayers. Godspeed, little feathered miracle. Try not to poop on anyone important. That one didn't make the book of ours. Monasteries near the coast were especially pigeon-savvy. The sea could isolate them for months, and boat travel wasn't always reliable plus. Monks weren't exactly eager sailors, but as with all pigeon stories, not everything was divine and orderly. There were rivalries. You may keep Gregory. He is greedy and lacks grace. Charity returned to us, bruised in spirit. Your feet is unholy. This pigeon drama eventually drew the attention of a bishop, who declared the birds neutral and ordered peace on feather and perch. Monks also experimented with message encryption. Yes, pigeons carried codes. They weren't. It was a shipment of goats. Sometimes, pigeons were treated as sacred signs. If one flew into the chapel mid-prayer, it might be taken as an omen. But not all monks approved of pigeon use. Some saw them as distracting, worldly, or just plain messy. There were complaints in monastery records. Brother Simon's birds had befouled the psalter again. We must build a net or resort to slingshots. Yes, slingshots. Even holy men have their limits. Yet despite the chaos, you're sitting now on a stone bench under the cloister's arches. The monks move quietly behind you, lighting evening candles, whispering verses, feeding their tiny airborne companions, all without Wi-Fi. You step outside the abbey walls and into a courtyard washed with moonlight, where something curious is happening. The air smells like wood smoke and damp stone, but the real surprise? It's not a monk who greets you. It's a grinning teenager holding a hooded pigeon in a satchel full of scrolls. Welcome to the darker corners of the pigeon world. Espionage, sabotage, and the sneaky art of bird-based betrayal. 'Cause where there's power, there's always someone trying to intercept it. And yes, that includes pigeons. Medieval rulers weren't just worried about swords and poisoned goblets. They had to protect their information roots in pigeons. Flying messengers that couldn't be locked or chained were juicy targets for spies and opportunists. In rare cases, they'd attach decoy messages designed to confuse the recipient. One famous incident involves a scroll that simply read, "One particularly dramatic story involves the fall of a minor noble house after a single intercepted message revealed a marriage alliance." Yes, falcons. Trained birds of prey were sometimes used to hunt messenger pigeons mid-flight. Traders, smugglers, and rogue scribes would watch lofts, track bird patterns, even try to breed their own stealth pigeons, smaller, faster, less likely to be recognized. Nobles kept them not just for sport, but as strategic tools. Historians still argue whether a falcon used in the Battle of Blue Heath took down 3 pigeons carrying tactical updates. The pigeons didn't make it. The falcon got a raw quail dinner and a very smug perch in the war tent. Loft guards. Boards encrypted scrolls, too tiny to decode without a magnifying crystal. Birds raised in one loft, stolen or purchased, retrained to fly somewhere else. It was in T-easery training. A homing pigeon was notoriously unreliable, but some claimed success using a mix of scent markers, food rewards, and absolute pigeon flattery. Some even wrote messages on slivers of silk instead of parchment, less rustling, harder to spot. Because if you could stall a message even by an hour, you could shift the timing of an ambush, a wedding, or a coronation. Saboteurs sometimes release flocks of trained crows to confuse messenger pigeons. Other times, they released female pigeons mid-flight to lure males off course. You glance back to see her slipping a coin pouch into her tunic and disappearing into the night. Was she loyal to the crown, the clergy, is the coin? Yes, even in the medieval skies, love could be weaponized. One queen reportedly used hair-thin silver thread wrapped around a pigeon's leg, stylish and secret. How many declarations of war, of love, of warning vanished into the trees, the rain, or the hands of someone who shouldn't have seen them? The same wings that carried peace treaties also carried threats. The same coups that signaled safety could, in the wrong hands, spelled disaster. One dyed dove made it all the way into a fortified manor before being caught preening itself in a mirror. Someone noticed the blue streak on its neck didn't quite match the others. That message, a forged treaty offer that could have caused a civil mess. Historians still argue whether the mirror saved a war. Maybe they were both. Maybe, like pigeons, they just followed the scent of home wherever that happened to be. Just like that, the engagement was broken, the land deal collapsed, and somebody ended up banished to a swampy outpost in Cornwall. You watch the teenager. Let's call her Tamsin slip through an alley and release the pigeon with a practiced flick. The bird soars, wings whispering against the night air, and disappears over the rooftops. Tamsin isn't a trainer. She's a runner, part of an underground web of message smugglers, double agents. Being curious and very nosy, he read it aloud at the local tavern. And the next day, half the village knew that Count Halbrich's daughter was eloping with a harpist. The Count didn't take it well. The harpist fled. The pigeon was later sold for beer money, and freelance interceptors who made their coin messing with other people's birds. Think of it as medieval cyber hacking, but instead of firewalls, you've got falcons. But intercepting messages wasn't always so dramatic. Sometimes the sabotage was subtle. Spies would bribe pigeon keepers, or sneak into lofts and swap scrolls. The turnip is not what it seems. Nobody's really sure what it meant. But it delayed a castle delivery by 4 days while they checked every root vegetable in the pantry. In certain cities, particularly port towns like Marseille or Bruges, pigeon monitoring became a kind of black market science. And then there was feather dyeing. Oh yes, pigeon disguises. Some enterprising agents dyed their pigeons to resemble local flocks, especially if they were sending messages behind enemy lines. Of course, the countermeasures grew more creative over time. There were even rumors of pigeon double agents.
Still,
Not every interception was cloak and dagger. Sometimes it was pure luck. A farmer in Saxony once found a pigeon sitting on his cart, scroll still attached. But perhaps the most unsettling part of pigeon espionage wasn't the interception, it was the delay. You pause beside a crumbling town wall, watching as another bird is released. It circles once, then speeds into the night. You wonder how many messages never made it. It's easy to romanticize medieval pigeons as noble messengers, but in truth, they were pawns in a game as slippery and tangled as the castle tapestries. And through it all, people like Tamsin kept climbing roofs, feeding bribes, and swapping scrolls in shadowy corners. Historians still argue whether runners like her were heroes or scoundrels. The dawn is thin and gray as you step onto a quiet stretch of countryside road, the earth soft beneath your boots. Morning dew clings to your cloak, and somewhere nearby, a pigeon flaps down from a tree and lands beside a weathered milestone. That meant messengers, loft keepers, royal inspectors, and oddly enough estate accountants. It's a new day, and pigeons, it turns out, are still on the job. You can smell hay, ink, and pigeon feed. Tax forms, crop reports, marriage invitations no one wanted. Reminders to please fix the leaky roof before it caves in on the guest chamber again. Pigeons weren't just for kings, they were for clerks. Those clerks were thorough. A scribe likely allergic to fresh air meets you at the gate holding a heavy ledger and looking sleep-deprived. He waves you in without much ceremony, because even after all the politics and pigeon sabotage, all the noble scrolls and clandestine, someone still had to keep the whole operation running. You arrive at one such estate now, a sprawling manor surrounded by orderly gardens and a small, expertly maintained dovecote. Here's something most people miss. For every grand royal pigeon message, there were hundreds of utterly mundane ones. Build in daily flights so they don't grow lazy. Rotate their perches so they don't get territorial. Their S1 delightful account of a royal inspector in 1402 who arrived to check on a suspected pigeon overuse situation. Apparently, the noble in question had been sending so many birds that neighboring lofts complained of air traffic congestion. One loft keeper, Lady Bronwyn of Eastmark, kept a diary noting that her best pigeon, a bird named Duchess Poohfoot, used to fly on Mondays. Let's give in crushed apricots first. Then again, who among us hasn't texted about pastries more than necessary? Spoiled feather biscuit, she wrote, but fastest flyer I've got. Traveling friars occasionally carried pigeons and offered courier services. Kind of a 14th century pop-up mailman system. They hop from perch to perch, pecking at feed and occasionally flapping their wings as if showing off. Each one has a small painted ring on its leg. The colors indicate destination, speed class, and sometimes a cheeky nickname like Sir Flaps-a-Lot. If you had a coin or two and a message ready, the friar might just deliver it for you, bird and all. One even left a ledger titled Coups and Coins, detailing years of freelance pigeon work. The manor behind you is already waking fires being lit, carts creaking, someone yelling about geese in the herb garden. Some were humble wooden boxes on rooftops. Others, like this manor, had stone towers with spiral stairs and ledges designed to give birds a good takeoff. If a noble-owned land spread across multiple counties, they'd station pigeons in each location. They weren't grand or glamorous most of the time, but they were reliable, invisible little gears in the massive, squeaky machine of medieval society. Reports of grain sales, peasant uprisings, or lost sheep could arrive in under a day. If you stole someone's trained pigeon, especially from a noble house, you could be fined, publicly shamed, or, in rare cases, locked in the stocks with feathers stuffed in your mouth for dramatic effect. Yet without it, a delivery might be missed, a dinner delayed, or a very particular noblewoman's wine forgotten. A little on the theatrical side, but medieval justice loved a good visual. This wasn't just useful, it was powerful. In a world where communication delays could mean missed harvests or surprise rebellions, pigeons gave the upper hand. The loft master was a paid position, and in wealthier households, it was a minor honor. You could make decent coin, get your own room, and assuming you didn't T-mine feathers in your soup work, in a job where nobody expected you to fight in any wars. One preserved document lists every pigeon message sent from a certain Yorkshire estate during the summer of 1389. Among the highlights, millstone cracked, send new, rain-flooded barley field, urgent, tell Margaret, yes, bring wine. The last one is circled twice in red ink. You imagine someone very excited about that message? Each estate with wealth or ambition had a pigeon loft. Training pigeons was repetitive work. Feed, release, wait, reward. Keep them bonded to their home. Sometimes these pigeons were used for long-distance estate management. That power didn't go unnoticed. State pigeon programs were audited by Crown agents from time to time. The inspector's final notes read, "Messages frequent, but content mundane. Includes 4 about pastry. Recommend light reprimand." Not exactly treasonous, but a bit excessive. Of course, not all estates had equal access. The poorest farms couldn't afford dovecotes or trained handlers. But they did sometimes borrow birds. There were rules, too. Pigeon theft was considered serious business. You walk through the dovecote now, passing rows of cooing birds. In the back corner of the loft, a young apprentice is wrapping a scroll onto a bird's leg. The scroll reads, "Roof fixed, sending guests Tuesday, hide the sherry." Imagine that message flying off to some distant cousin, perhaps with a pigeon trained to dodge hawks and know where the good sunbathing tiles are. Pigeons, in their own strange way, were part of the daily heartbeat of estate life. You stand now on the estate wall, watching as one bird takes off, wings flashing in the early light. And somewhere in the air, a pigeon carries a message so dull, so domestic, that it might never be remembered. And that, as history shows us, simply would not do. The afternoon drapes over you like a warm, lazy blanket as you leave the manor grounds and wander toward a low hill. The trees whispered gently overhead and off in the distance. You can just make out the silhouette of a lone pigeon circling down toward its home loft. But how did it all wind down? What happens to pigeon messengers when the world outgrows them? They didn't vanish with the Tudors or the Renaissance. After all, what if the roads were blocked? What if messengers got sick? What if you just didn't trust a sweaty horseman with your secret potato treaty? Even as printing presses churned out books and postal systems rolled across kingdoms, pigeons flapped on, stubbornly devoted to their original purpose. You watch it glide effortlessly, the way an old professional might enter a room cool, quiet, unimpressed. By now, you've followed these medieval pigeons from castle towers to abbey courtyards, from shadowy rooftops to royal feast halls. A few strains of the old messenger birds were bred into what we now call racing pigeons competitive. Fast, occasionally spoiled birds who've traded political intrigue for shiny ribbons and applause. You settle under a chestnut tree, the bark rough at your back, and consider a strange truth. Pigeons in many places simply stayed. Some lords, refusing to give up old traditions, maintained lofts well into the 17th century, part nostalgia, part backup plan. A few even penned odes to the faithful courier, the idea that information could travel independently above the fray. Quietly and faithfully, it's a concept that echoes even in our modern metaphors. A little bird told me, we say. We whisper about carrier pigeons with a wink, knowing full well that they once whispered secrets of kings and queens. Historians, unsurprisingly, argue whether this is myth, superstition, or just someone's eccentric aunt feeding the birds too much elderberry wine. Maybe it's just a bird with good snacks nearby. Both options feel equally magical now. Trusted them with messages, decisions, whole futures wrapped in ribbon and ink. In sleepy corners of England, old noble families claimed their ancestors' pigeons had carried news of Henry VIII's mood swings or warnings of highwaymen. That some secrets are small enough to tuck under a wing and quiet enough to glide across time. They were the wireless messengers of the medieval world. For satellites and signals, there were coups and feathers and scrolls tied with bits of linen. Total nonsense, most likely, but who doesn't love a dramatic family legend involving birds? One bishop in northern Italy reportedly kept a pigeon loft operational until 1654, insisting that his birds were swifter than rumor and far less prone to gossip. The sun sinks low behind distant trees, and a hush settles over the landscape like a well-worn blanket. It pecks at something in the dirt, fluffs its feathers, and gives you a look. You nod, a little sleepy now, and wonder how many of its ancestors flew through storms to deliver some forgotten decree. The sharp clatter of the manor, the distant calls of merchants, even the rustling gossip of courtiers all slip into silence. What's left is the warmth of the earth beneath you. It's the faint hum of wind in the leaves, and the sense that you've traveled somewhere secret and curious, just for a little while. The grand stone structures became landmarks, sometimes repurposed into tool sheds or children's playhouses. You can still hear the rustle of feathers, the quiet coo of a bird somewhere overhead, and the distant echoes of a life where messages flew, unseen but deeply felt. Some were left to crumble, while others became parts of urban architecture, their original purpose forgotten. You've probably walked past one and never realized it once housed airborne royal gossip. Let the pigeons keep flying, silently, across the landscapes of your dreams. Let the scrolls stay wrapped, the rooftops fade from view, the echoes of wings grow distant. In knowing that history, even its strangest corners, holds stories that are quieter than wars and gentler than kings. Stories about ordinary birds with extraordinary jobs, about the strange, simple ways humans have always tried to reach one another, which, to be fair, is kind of brilliant. But the world was changing. Human couriers were getting faster. New technology, like the optical telegraph in the 18th century, basically towers that signaled each other with shutters, could transmit codes across vast distances in real time. Pigeons couldn't compete with that kind of speed or precision, especially not in heavy rain. Historians still argue whether this was the final blow to their golden age, or just another nudge toward retirement. Even so, the legacy lingered. Many pigeon lofts were converted into simple dovecotes or garden towers. And the pigeons themselves? Well, many returned to ordinary bird life, nesting in cities, lingering near old lofts, or hanging around taverns where the breadcrumbs were reliable. But here's the fun part. Even as the formal pigeon networks faded, their mystique remained. Writers and poets of the 18th and 19th centuries romanticized them. There's even an enduring fringe theory that a particular line of pigeons descended from a royal loft in Normandy still carries messages of the blood, flying cryptic routes at certain times of year. Still, the pigeon's legacy quietly shaped the way we think about communication. And in a way, pigeons prepared the world for invisible messages. You shift slightly beneath the tree as a soft breeze rustles the grass, and a pigeona, real one, fat and unhurried, lands a few feet from you. Maybe it's great grand pigeon, once dodged falcons over whales or carried an apology to a duchess whose feast was delayed, because in the end, the true wonder wasn't in the birds themselves, it was in the way people trusted them. That trust, weirdly, is what's lasted. Even now, we like to believe that somewhere, a pigeon could still take flight with a message only we understand. You watch the bird flap upward and disappear into the branches above. Maybe that's the last message of the day. The air grows still now, and the sky is turned the soft color of ash and wool. You ease back against the tree trunk, eyes half closed, the day's journey tucked gently into your memory. The world around you fades a little, softens at the edges. There's comfort in that. So let yourself drift now. And in that soft, still space between waking and sleep, just listen. Good night.